Welcome back. Now it's time for our keynote speaker, Jesus Mantas of IBM. Jesus is the Senior Managing Partner responsible for strategy, innovation, and corporate development for IBM's Global Business Services, a $17 billion unit of IBM. During his time at IBM, Jesus has led IBM's business consulting, GBS Latin America, and business process units. He currently co-chairs IBM's Hispanic Diversity Council and serves on IBM's senior leadership team, technology leadership team, and AI ethics board. Outside of the office, Jesus is on the board of Biogen and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global AI Council. He has also published and has been quoted in media on topics such as leadership resiliency, human-centric design, behavioral economics, and Hispanic diversity and inclusion. He holds degrees in telecommunications, software engineering, and business administration, and his illustrious career also includes being an adjunct professor at the University of California, Irvine. A fun fact about Jesus, he served as an officer in the Spanish Air Force. More recently, he was featured in Hispanic Executive's Visibility issue, which highlighted members of the LGBT plus community and also inmigrantes, executives born abroad that immigrated to the United States and are now leading at major firms, executives like Jesus. Jesus, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. And it was exhausting to hear that introduction. You were way too kind.
You're an incredibly interesting person, so I had to try to fit it in. But let's start by sharing with the audience a bit about your journey, your background, your journey to IBM, and why do you love working there today?
Yeah, I mean, my journey to IBM passes from, a journey from Spain, where I was born and raised, and I was, first 25 years of my life was there, to then the United States. And when I came to the United States, frankly, I came to the United States just to spend 3 years, hopefully practice or learn my English, and then go back to Spain. And the joke is I'm still here because I'm still learning English. So, but what happened is I've always been very curious. I was an, okay student. I did well in university. I kind of got serious on it. And I was always very curious, especially about the intersection of complexity, like the human body, complex systems, business and technology. So it was always, my hero has always been Da Vinci, right? Can you put arts and science together? Can you put business and technology together? And how do you do that? So when I came to the United States, that, played well in the world of consulting, something that when I was back on Spain, I knew nothing about. I actually thought it was kind of interesting. Why would people pay you more for you to be a consultant? I thought it was fascinating when I was a junior consultant that people were paying me to learn a lot of stuff about them and then give them advice. I thought wow, I said, I'm going to do this quickly because eventually they're going to figure it out. This is going to end. Guess what? That's what I'm still doing every day. So I spent 3 years as a subcontractor to Ernst & Young, joined as a manager in Pricewaterhouse. That was when my career took off. Joined in 97, made partner in 2001. Then Enron happened. Then we had to basically separate audit from consulting. That's when IBM bought in 2002 the consulting unit, which is how I ended up in IBM. I don't think I would have proactively had the foresight to say, oh, I want to be in IBM. But once I found myself in IBM, it was like the kid on the candy store, or kind of it was Disneyland. I went to a place that spends $5 billion on research, that had 7 Nobel Prize winners and counting. So you had that, but then you had one of the kind of most trusted brands that is in charge of the business backbone of a lot of things that matter, like the banking system or the utility system or the airplanes, or sending people to the moon. So I thought it was wow, I wouldn't have chosen this, but this is exactly what I think I'm good at, which is to get a purpose, whether it is a society purpose or a business purpose, get technology, and then put it together in a way that it makes sense, it can be delivered, it can add value, And that has been my journey for the last 20 something years. I was, I was a partner in the high technology practice. Then I became the leader of the Americas consulting practice for the mid-sized companies. From there, I went to Sao Paulo and ran Latin America business. From there, I came back and I ran the global business process outsourcing. From there, I ran business consulting globally. And now, as you mentioned, I run strategy, the innovation, the offering packaging, and then mergers, acquisitions, buying and selling companies.
That's great. In your Hispanic executive interview, you said that over the next decade, we have a responsibility to close the gap with Latinos in education, workforce, and leadership. Not just for the benefit of the Hispanic community, but also for the benefit of the greater US society. So I want to know why this matters, kind of the dumb question of the day, but why does it matter? And what could people joining us today do to close those gaps?
I mean, it matters. In one word, is mathematics. So if you think about it, we are right now 18.5% of the population. Will be 20% of the population by the end of the decade. We are the largest minority, and it's also the only one that is growing. We are the youngest minority as well, or majority for that matter. 6 of 10 Hispanics are less than 35 years old. So we are the future of the demographics. We are the future of the labor force. And we're about $2 trillion of GDP. But what maybe is less known is as we Hispanics, and more of us in the US, buy cell phones, open bank accounts, use cars, we have created in the last decade over half of every job in the country. So not only jobs for Hispanics, jobs for everybody. So if this engine doesn't keep going, there is no other demographic, and again, it's mathematics, that can create jobs for Hispanics or anybody else, right? So we kind of hold on ourselves the future of like the next generation of labor force. And think about that. We are 18.5% of the population, and we are roughly, if I'm really, really, really generous, maybe 4% of the executive ranks. Right. So that is a significant imbalance that we need to correct, not for anything other than unless in the places where decisions are being made, there is the awareness and the knowledge of the culture that drives that engine, then it's very unlikely that we're going to be optimizing that engine. So not only this is a Hispanic problem for Hispanics, this is actually a U.S. demographic and U.S. economics and U.S. labor force challenge. I mean, think about that right now. We have like 5 million jobs open in the United States, and there's no other demographic that can create enough people that can be qualified for those jobs. So that's why I said that.
Yeah, and like Dr. Robert Rodriguez likes to say, if you don't have a Latino strategy, you don't have a growth strategy, and that's I haven't heard those metrics, and that's incredible. Yeah, I know that mentorship is important to you. Can you speak about whatever mentorship initiatives that you're currently involved with, and why, as a high-ranking executive at IBM, is that still something that you take on?
I think mentorship is important because in almost every success story, whether it's my own or any others that I see, it was made possible by other people that saw in ourselves things that we couldn't see and encourage us to take risks that maybe otherwise we wouldn't have taken, and open our eyes to possibilities that weren't there. And without mentorship, the problem is you end up in this closed loop. Is like, because your surrounding is not aware of the possibilities, you're not aware of the possibilities. And then you're limited to what you know, right? Is like, so mentorship is the way in which you can break that mold. That it doesn't matter what your economic background or where you were born. It doesn't matter what the zip code that you live is. If you have potential and you're going to work hard and somebody can orient you as to what the possibilities could be, then they're giving you a chance that otherwise you may not take for the simple reason that you didn't know you could take it. And I think that's what's important. I think, frankly, I think it's a feature of our culture as Hispanics. We like to be helpful. I think it's deeply ingrained on some, if there is such a thing as Hispanic DNA, some code somewhere there, there is 2 or 3 traits, right? And one of them is this, to kind of like be thankful, pay forward, do things not for an economic motive, but just because it feels like the right thing to do. And frankly, I remember when I was like young and when I was in Spain working, and I looked at like those people that spent time to help me, and I was like, I had that feeling of like, wow. And now I have that reverse feeling, which is the time that I spend on paying forward or giving on mentoring is typically some of the most rewarding time of my week. It's like I said, like, listen, if I just change one life, one possibility, my day was worth it. So I do, one of the things that I've done is like, the days get busy for everybody, right? And we all work long hours, and before you know it, you like work, and then you have your family. So I decided to institutionalize it, mentoring with myself, where I block Saturday mornings. So I have a couple of routines. I try to kind of like exercise 8 to 10 in the morning, and then kind of like 10 to 1, I block time, and that becomes my mentoring time. And basically every Saturday I just line up. There's a lot of people that come to me, and I just line up and I, make sure. And that's how I manage also capacity as well. It's like I would love to spend 100 hours on mentoring, but I can't. I have to do other things. So I do that with people in 2 or 3 areas. College, people that, were fortunate, Hispanics that they're going to go to college. What does that mean? How do you open possibilities? How do I help them? Some of the experienced professionals, and, how do I get more people in either boards or in executive ranks? And then entrepreneurs, and especially Latinas, so female Hispanic entrepreneurs, which in my view are kind of some of the savviest bets anybody could make.
That's great. You certainly know a thing or two about perseverance. I know that when you first came here, you were nervous about your accent. And how did you turn that perceived weakness into a strength? And how would you encourage people to turn their weaknesses into strengths?
Yes, I mean, it was not only nervousness. I landed in October 1994, and 3 weeks later, I was told that I had made a mistake and I better go back to Spain because I would never succeed in the business of consulting. So it was made very clear to me that I was not, sufficiently dominating the English language, or, other things for that matter. And I had a couple of choices. One is you kind of like believe that's it, or you look at your shoes and get depressed, or you kind of set a goal to prove them wrong. And I think maybe part of my personality is I don't need a lot of people to tell me what I'm doing right, but I have a thick skin when people say, hey, this is not good enough. And I think that proved it at that time. But I do it even in sports. I mean, sports that I like to play, like other Spaniards, I'm just not as good as those other, is tennis. And typically I had a decent forehand, but a horrible backhand. And you know what happens when you have that in tennis is what you do is you run around to always hit forehands because that's the one that you do. But then that perpetuates the weakness on your backhand. So what I actually intentionally did in one of those things is I said, you know what? I mean, I've got to like face this. I'm never going to be good enough unless I really develop the backhand. So I actually took classes where I could only in the entire hour hit backhands no matter what. And they were horrible. I always wanted to run around and hit the forehand. It's like, nope, you've got to do it. And it's, I think you have to have that resilience because it's very humbling when you're kind of half good at something to take a step back and be bad again. But it's the only way you develop new muscles. One of the reasons you mentioned that I was an adjunct professor in UCI, which I was, but that was intentional. That was one of the ways I said, if you really want to do something well, put yourself in a situation when you have to teach it. So that was part of me. I was terrified of speaking in public. I was horrible. I like literally my legs would shake if I had to give a presentation to like a room with more than 3 people. And I figured, I said, like, well, this is not acceptable. So I actually, the combination of getting better at English and the combination of figuring out how do I develop a skill to articulate without like burning my career in the way, I said, well, maybe I can be a professor in UC Irvine. I'll create a topic, which I did. I created a class. They accepted me. And then, my students were forgiving enough to kind of like give me a break with the English and, kind of like let me develop that skill. And after 3 years, I was much better in English and I was much better presenting in public. So I think you kind of like, if you take one thing that you're not that good and you just stay on it, I'll tell you right now I have the opposite problem in tennis. Is now I try to hit only backhands because that's better. That's better than the forehand. So I have the opposite now.
That's great. You got to face the backhand. I love it. Um, we've gone through so much recently as a society and as individuals, and very much still going through it now. What has this experience taught you? What has inspired you? What's challenged you? And how did it change your perception of the work that you do, perspective of the work that you do day in and day out at IBM?
Yeah, boy, what a species moment. What an opportunity. As bad as tragic as it is for the millions of people in the world, just over 500,000 here in the United States that have lost their lives and all their families and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But what a unique moment to learn. Like, I mean, sometimes you can't change bad things happening to you, but you can change and you can choose that they don't define you. I think a little bit is I've adopted that attitude when I'm faced with some form of trauma. Whether it's a health issue, whether it's a family issue, or in this case, the pandemic. And I maybe a few reflections that I will share is one is the one thing I learned is resilience sometimes could be a bad word. And let me explain what I mean by that is most people tell you in these situations to kind of like show resilience, but there is an embedded, unstated implication that when something bad happens, the best that you could do is to go back to before. So resilience is sometimes puts you a blinders of saying, wait a minute, what if the go forward could be much better than the past was, even though we're going through a massive trauma in the way? And I think that's why I learned that by actually using the word resilience in a context where somebody that had lost, function in fighting a war, told me is like, well, why do you think I'm resilient? It's like that. I don't want to go back to the way it was. I can be much better than that. And it was such a humbling experience that I learned that from the pandemic. I saw a lot of businesses and a lot of people where overnight their livelihood was gone.
Yeah.
Whether you had a restaurant, I had a friend in Bulgaria, his entire business was events, in-person events.
Yeah.
He had an event in Spain with 15,000 people committed that he had put all the money that he had.
Yeah.
And that was blown apart. And you kind of like have to go and say, like, how do I become resilient? No, he figures like, okay, well, that's gone. So now that's not going to be it. What are we going to do? And then he leaned in onto, I'm going to invent the world of digital events. And the maximum he could do before the pandemic was 15,000 people. That was the maximum he ever did. Well, now he does events with like 100,000 people. So, in a way, his world after the pandemic, he couldn't see it at the time, but it became much better than the one before. So that was the first one. I think the second thing that I think it taught all of us is we had all heard about authentic leadership, servant leadership. Well, this was the time that was the only leadership that you could actually exercise.
Right.
There wasn't any other. It was about empathy and understanding, and you better figure this out because that is the only thing that will make you an acceptable leader, not even a good leader. an acceptable leader is to figure that out. And I think the third one was this idea again. It's like, you start taking yourself less seriously, and then you say, what is that I do every day that will have a impact that will matter in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years? And suddenly you stop worrying about stuff that like really doesn't matter that much. We get worked up in the everyday for things that don't matter that much, and you become a lot more effective in actually, in my way. I've spent more time making everybody in my team or every one of my colleagues more successful without worrying. It's like, who's going to get the credit? It's like, well, it doesn't really matter. What matters, like 3 years from now, 5 years from now, nobody will remember who gets what credit. But what they will remember is like, is that person a better person? Do they have a better job? Are their kids better? So then this idea of focusing on things that 3 years from now, 5 years from now matter, and making an impact on a few things is something that the pandemic taught me as well.
Well, we like to end these events with a call to action for our audience. What's your call to action today, and what would you love to have people do post-event?
It's interesting. I was thinking about this, and I got together with the ERGs, the equivalent ERGs in IBM. We call them BRGs, and we get them together. And I told them, I said, if there is one thing that you're going to remember, I asked them a question. I said, well, tell me, what do you think is the purpose of your BRG? Like, why do you exist? And they all had, some form of an answer, even though kind of like, they had to think about that. And after he told me that, there was like 5, 6 things. Then I said, okay, and how much impact are you making on, pick the most important one, on that one, whether it is retaining people or creating community or contributing to, schools, whatever that is, or hire from university. And then they tell me what it was. And then I said, what would it take for you to make an impact 10 times bigger than that on that thing? Like, what if that is the only thing that you would do? And suddenly they said, well, we would have to do this and we will have to do that. And so suddenly it kind of like reoriented them. But by the way, they realized it's like, by the way, it is actually feasible. I could be recruiting 10 times more than I'm recruiting, or I could be contributing to 10 more schools, or I could be helping 10 times more people. But it takes that intentionality and become good at one thing versus being involved in many things. So I would encourage everybody to do that reflection, and whatever the one thing is you think is going to matter the most 3 years from now, 5 years from now, figure out what impact are you doing today, multiply that times 10, and then ask yourself, what is it that it will take? And then just do that. Because when you look back 3 years, that decision will have had a tremendous impact in what you achieve and in the impact that you achieve and the sustainability that you achieve. So that would be the one thing that I would leave with everybody. Just pick one thing, multiply times 10 the impact, and focus on that.
Awesome. Well, there you have it, everyone. Pick that one thing and scale it. Jesús, gracias. Es un placer hablar contigo.
Igualmente, Pedro. Un abrazo para todos.
Thank you.